The baby's cry cut through the silence like a knife. Reed Carter sat on the cold floorboards of his cabin, cradling his newborn son against his chest. The child's wails were raw, desperate, hungry. Reed rocked him gently, but his arms felt weak, his movements clumsy. He had no idea what he was doing. His wife had died 3 hours ago. The midwife had left at dawn, her face grave and apologetic. She'd wrapped the body, said a prayer, and told Reed she would send word to the preacher. Then she'd gone, taking the lantern's warmth with her. Now it was just Reed and the baby. Samuel. His wife had chosen the name 2 months before, her hand resting on her swollen belly, her smile soft and certain. She would never see him grow. Reed looked down at the child in his arms. Samuel's face was red and scrunched, his tiny fists trembling. He was so small. So fragile. Reed had built the cradle beside the bed with his own hands, sanding every edge smooth, carving his wife's initials into the headboard. He'd imagined her sitting there, nursing the baby, humming the lullabies her mother had taught her. But the cradle sat empty now. And Reed didn't know how to feed a newborn. Outside, the blizzard howled. Snow piled against the cabin walls, seeping through cracks in the wood. The wind rattled the shutters and moaned through the eaves. Reed glanced toward the window. He couldn't see past the glass. The world had disappeared into white. The stove fire was dying. Reed shifted Samuel to one arm and reached for another log. His hands shook as he fed it into the flames. The heat was fading fast, and he had maybe 3 more logs left. After that, he'd have to go outside. Dig through the snow. Find the woodpile buried somewhere near the back of the cabin. But he couldn't leave the baby alone. Not even for a minute. Samuel wailed louder, his little body arching in Reed's arms. Reed stood, pacing the narrow room, bouncing the child the way he'd seen his wife do with neighbors' babies. It didn't work. The crying only grew sharper, more frantic. "I know," Reed whispered, his voice cracking. "I know you're hungry. I don't know what to do." He tried giving Samuel water from a cloth. The baby had choked and screamed. Reed had no milk. No way to get any. The nearest neighbor was Mrs. Callahan, 2 miles west, but the trail was buried. He couldn't make it on foot, not in this storm. And even if he couldn't carry a newborn through a blizzard. They were trapped. Reed sank down beside the cradle, still holding Samuel close. The baby's cries had grown weaker now, more tired. Reed felt his own exhaustion pulling at him like a weight. He hadn't slept since his wife's labor began 2 nights ago. He'd held her hand through the pain, whispered promises he couldn't keep, begged God for mercy that never came. Now he was alone. And his son was dying in his arms. "I'm sorry," Reed whispered, his forehead pressed to Samuel's. "I'm so sorry. I don't know how to do this without her." The fire popped softly on the stove. The wind screamed outside. And Reed Carter, 26 years old and hollowed out by grief, bowed his head and prayed for a miracle he didn't believe would come. Then, through the storm, came a knock at the door. Reed's head snapped up. For a moment, he thought he'd imagined it. The wind played tricks sometimes, rattling loose boards, throwing branches against the walls. But then it came again, 3 deliberate knocks, firm and clear. Someone was outside. Reed stood carefully, Samuel still whimpering against his shoulder. He crossed the room in 4 strides and pulled open the door. A gust of wind and snow hit him like a fist, and he had to squint against the white. A figure stood on his porch, bundled in a heavy wool coat, face nearly hidden by a scarf. Snow clung to every fold of fabric. For a heartbeat, Reed couldn't tell who it was. Then the scarf came down. "Mr. Carter," the woman said quietly. Her voice was steady despite the cold. "I heard what happened. Reed stared. Miss Doyle. Margaret Doyle was the schoolteacher from the settlement 3 miles east. Reed had seen her in town a handful of times, young, soft-spoken, always carrying books under her arm. She taught the children their letters in a one-room schoolhouse near the church. He'd never spoken more than a few polite words to her. And now she was standing on his porch in the middle of a blizzard. "I came as soon as I could," Margaret said. Her cheeks were windburned, her lips pale. "May I come in?" Reed stepped aside without a word. Margaret moved past him, brushing snow from her coat. She carried a leather satchel pressed close to her chest, protecting it from the storm. Reed shut the door behind her, and the cabin fell into sudden, muffled silence. Margaret looked around quickly, taking in the scene, the dying fire, the cradle, the bed in the corner still unmade. Her eyes lingered on Samuel, and something softened in her expression. "How long has he been crying?" she asked. "Hours," Reed said hoarsely. "I can't. I don't have any way to feed him." Margaret set the satchel on the table and unwound her scarf. "I brought milk," she said simply. "Fresh this morning. I kept it wrapped and close to keep it from freezing." Reed felt something crack open in his chest. He couldn't speak. Margaret moved with quiet efficiency. She opened the satchel and pulled out a small glass bottle wrapped in cloth, along with a tin cup and a clean rag. She poured a small amount of milk into the cup and set it near the stove to warm. Then she turned to Reed, her hands outstretched. "May I?" Reed hesitated. Samuel was the only thing he had left of his wife. The only thing keeping him tethered to the world. But the baby was crying again, weak and desperate, and Reed had nothing to give him. He placed Samuel in Margaret's arms. She cradled the child gently, adjusting his blanket, her touch careful and sure. Samuel squirmed for a moment, then seemed to sense something different, someone who knew what they were doing. Margaret tested the milk with her finger, then dipped the corner of the rag into the cup. She touched Samuel's lips. The baby latched on immediately. Reed watched, stunned, as his son drank. Margaret worked patiently, dipping the rag again and again, letting Samuel feed at his own pace. The crying stopped. The cabin filled with the soft sounds of nursing, the crackle of the fire, the wind outside. Margaret glanced up at Reed. "When did you last eat?" "I don't remember." "And sleep?" Reed shook his head. Margaret's expression was firm but kind. "Then you'll do both. Now. I'll tend to him." "Miss Doyle, I can't ask you to." "You didn't ask," she said quietly. "Let me help." Reed didn't argue. He sank onto the bench by the table, his body suddenly too heavy to hold upright. Margaret moved around the cabin with quiet purpose, still cradling Samuel in one arm. She added another log to the stove, adjusted the damper, and stirred the coals until the flames rose higher. Warmth began to spread through the room again. Samuel had stopped crying entirely. His tiny eyes were half closed, his breathing soft and even. Margaret settled into the rocking chair near the fire, the one Reed's wife had sat in every evening while mending clothes. It felt strange to see someone else there. Wrong, almost. But also somehow right. Margaret looked down at the baby, her expression gentle. "He's beautiful," she said softly. Reed's throat tightened. His mother wanted to name him Samuel. After her father. "It suits him." Silence fell between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Margaret rocked slowly, the chair creaking in rhythm. Samuel's breathing deepened. He was asleep. "How did you know?" Reed asked finally. "About my wife. Mrs. Callahan sent her boy to the settlement yesterday before the storm got bad," Margaret said. "He told us what happened. I packed what I could and left at first light." Reed stared at her. "You walked 3 miles in a blizzard. It wasn't so bad when I started. The worst hit about halfway. She said it matter-of-factly, as if risking her life was the most ordinary thing in the world. You could have died out there. Margaret glanced at him, her eyes calm. So could he. Reed didn't know what to say to that. He looked down at his hands, calloused, dirt-stained, still trembling slightly. He'd built this cabin with these hands. Cleared the land. Raised the walls. Made a home for the family he thought he'd have. And now that family was gone, except for a child he didn't know how to keep alive. I don't know what I'm doing, he said quietly. No one does at first, Margaret replied. But you'll learn. What if I can't? She looked at him then, really looked at him, and Reed saw something in her face he hadn't expected, certainty. You will, she said. Because you have to. Samuel stirred in her arms, making a soft sound. Margaret adjusted his blanket, tucking it more snugly around him. He'll need to eat again in a few hours. I brought enough milk for today and tomorrow, but after that, you'll need to arrange something with one of the nursing mothers in town. Mrs. Hendricks might help, or Mrs. Callahan if you can reach her once the storm clears. Reed nodded slowly. He hadn't thought that far ahead. Hadn't been able to think past the next minute, the next breath. There's bread in my satchel, Margaret continued. And some dried meat. You should eat something. I'm not hungry. Eat anyway. Her tone left no room for argument. Reed reached for the satchel and found the food wrapped in cloth. He forced himself to take a bite of bread. It tasted like sawdust, but he chewed and swallowed. Then another bite. His body seemed to wake up, reminding him how long it had been since he'd eaten. Margaret watched him for a moment, then turned her attention back to Samuel. When did you last sleep? 2 days. Maybe 3. Then you'll sleep now. I'll watch him. Reed shook his head. I can't ask you to stay. You're not asking. I'm telling you. Margaret's voice was gentle but unyielding. You're no good to him if you collapse. So you'll eat, and then you'll rest. I'll wake you if he needs you. Reed wanted to protest. Wanted to say he couldn't accept this much kindness from a near stranger. But his body was already giving in, exhaustion pulling at him like an undertow. Just for an hour, he murmured. As long as you need, Margaret said. Reed woke to the sound of humming. For a confused moment, he thought his wife was there, that the last 2 days had been a terrible dream. But when he opened his eyes, he saw Margaret sitting by the fire, Samuel cradled in her arms. She was humming a melody Reed didn't recognize, something low and soothing. The baby was awake but quiet, staring up at her with dark, unfocused eyes. The cabin was warm. The storm still raged outside, but inside, everything felt strangely peaceful. Reed sat up slowly, his back stiff from sleeping on the narrow bed. The light through the window was dim and gray, late afternoon, maybe early evening. He'd slept for hours. Margaret glanced over. You're awake. I didn't mean to sleep that long. You needed it. She stood carefully, carrying Samuel toward him. He's been fed twice. Changed once. He's doing well. Reed took his son, and Samuel made a small noise, his face scrunching. But he didn't cry. Reed looked down at him, this tiny person who turned his world inside out, and felt something shift in his chest. Not love yet, he was too numb for that. But maybe the beginning of it. The possibility. Thank you, Reed said quietly. Margaret nodded. She moved to the table and began repacking her satchel. Reed watched her, suddenly aware of how much she'd done. Fed his son. Keep the fire going. Let him rest. She'd given him something he thought he'd lost, a few hours of peace. The storm should break by morning, Margaret said. I'll need to head back then. But I can come again in a few days. Bring more milk and supplies. Reed frowned. Miss Doyle, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. She turned to face him, her expression serious. But winter's hard, Mr. Carter. Especially alone. And especially with a newborn. She paused. I'd like to help. If you'll let me. Reed didn't know what to say. Pride warred with desperation. He'd always taken care of himself, never asked for charity. But this wasn't about him anymore. It was about Samuel. I'd be grateful, he said finally. Something softened in Margaret's face. Then it settled. The days that followed blurred together. The storm cleared, and Margaret returned to the settlement. But 3 days later, she came back. She brought fresh milk, a pot of beef broth, and clean clothes for the baby. She stayed for an afternoon, teaching Reed how to swaddle Samuel properly, how to recognize when he was hungry versus when he just needed comfort. Hold him close to your chest, she instructed, guiding Reed's arms. He can hear your heartbeat. It calms him. Reed did as she said, and Samuel's fussing quieted. Margaret smiled. There. You're learning. She came again the following week. And the week after that. Each visit, she brought something, food, blankets, firewood she'd paid the miller boy to haul. She showed Reed how to warm milk to the right temperature, how to check if Samuel had a fever, and how to soothe him when nothing else worked. Slowly, the cabin changed. The oppressive weight of grief began to lift, replaced by something steadier. Routine. Purpose. Reed learned to anticipate Samuel's needs, to read his cries, to function on broken sleep. The baby grew stronger, his cries louder, his grip firmer. And Margaret became a constant presence. She'd arrive in the late morning, her cheeks pink from the cold, always carrying something in her arms. She'd sit by the fire and talk while Reed worked, about her students, about books she'd read, about nothing in particular. Her voice filled the silence that had threatened to swallow him whole. Reed found himself listening for her footsteps on the porch. Found himself straightening the cabin before she arrived, as if her opinion mattered. Found himself noticing things, the way she tilted her head when Samuel cooed, the way she hummed without realizing it, the way her hands moved with such gentle certainty. By the time February arrived, Margaret's visits had become woven into the fabric of Reed's life. She came twice a week, sometimes 3 times when the weather allowed. She'd knock softly, let herself in, and immediately reach for Samuel, who had begun to recognize her. The baby would kick his legs and make soft noises when he saw her, his small face brightening in a way that made Reed's chest ache. He knows you, Reed said one afternoon, watching Margaret cradle his son. Of course he does. Margaret smiled down at Samuel, touching his tiny nose with her finger. Don't you, sweet boy? Samuel grabbed her finger and held on tight. Margaret laughed, and the sound filled the cabin with warmth Reed hadn't felt in months. He realized, with a strange jolt, that he was smiling too. But not everyone in town smiled when they spoke of Margaret Doyle's visits. Reed first heard the whispers when he went into the general store for supplies. He was waiting for Mr. Harris to weigh out cornmeal when he caught fragments of conversation from 2 women near the fabric display. Every few days, I've heard. A young unmarried woman, spending all that time. Not proper, if you ask me. Reed's jaw tightened. He paid for his goods quickly and left without meeting anyone's eyes. On the ride home, anger simmered beneath his ribs. Margaret had saved his son's life. She'd asked for nothing in return. And now people were talking about her like she'd done something shameful. When she came the next day, Reed couldn't keep quiet. People are talking, he said abruptly. Margaret was preparing milk for Samuel. She didn't look up. People always talk. About you. Coming here. I know. Reed frowned. It doesn't bother you? Margaret set down the bottle and met his eyes. What bothers me is the thought of you and Samuel struggling alone when I could help. That's what matters. She paused. Does it bother you? The talk? It did. But not for the reasons people might think. It bothered him because Margaret deserved better than gossip. Because she was kind and good, and the town was repaying her compassion with judgment. I don't want you getting hurt because of me, Reed said quietly. I'm not hurt by words, Mr. Carter. I'm made of sturdier stuff than that. She picked up Samuel and sat down in the rocking chair. Besides, they'll find something else to gossip about soon enough. They always do. But the whispers didn't fade. If anything, they grew louder. Reed noticed it in the way certain people averted their eyes when he passed. In the tight smiles from church ladies who used to greet him warmly. In the pointed questions from Mrs. Whitmore about whether he'd found proper help for the baby yet. Margaret brushed it all off with quiet dignity. But Reed saw the way her shoulders stiffened when women whispered as she walked by. Saw the way she kept her visits slightly shorter, more circumspect. It ate at him. Still, she kept coming. And Reed couldn't bring himself to ask her to stop. Because the truth was, he needed her. Not just for Samuel, though the baby thrived under her care, but for himself. The cabin felt different when she was there. Less like a tomb and more like a home. Her presence steadied him in ways he couldn't explain and didn't dare examine too closely. They'd sit together in the evening sometimes, after Samuel fell asleep. Margaret would mend Reed's shirts or read aloud from books she brought. Reed would work on small repairs, fixing a loose hinge or carving a new spoon. They didn't always talk, but the silence between them felt comfortable. Safe. One evening, as Margaret prepared to leave, she paused at the door. Mr. Carter, may I ask you something? Of course. Do you regret letting me help? Truly. Reed looked at her, this woman who'd walked through a blizzard for a stranger's child, who'd given so much and asked for nothing. No, he said. Never. March brought the first hints of spring, but it also brought an unexpected absence. Margaret arrived one morning with her usual basket, but her expression was troubled. Samuel was asleep in his cradle, and Reed was mending a fence rail at the table. He looked up when she entered, immediately sensing something was wrong. What is it? Margaret set down the basket slowly. My sister sent word. She's fallen ill, badly. Her husband passed last year, and she's alone with 3 children. She paused, her fingers worrying the edge of her shawl. I need to go to her. She lives near Fort Laramie. It's a 2-day journey. Reed felt something drop in his stomach. How long will you be gone? I don't know. A week, maybe 2. However long it takes. Margaret looked at Samuel, then back at Reed. Her eyes were apologetic. I'm sorry. I know the timing isn't. Don't apologize, Reed said quickly. Your sister needs you. Of course you have to go. I've arranged for Mrs. Hendricks to bring milk while I'm away. And I've left extra supplies, enough for at least 10 days. She moved to the table and began unpacking the basket, explaining where everything was, giving detailed instructions Reed barely heard. All he could think was that she was leaving. You'll be all right, Margaret said, though it sounded like she was trying to convince herself as much as him. You've learned so much. You're a good father now, Mr. Carter. Reed nodded, not trusting his voice. Margaret stayed until mid-afternoon, showing Reed one more time how to prepare the bottles, how to soothe Samuel when he was fussy. When she finally gathered her things to leave, Reed walked her to the door. Safe travels, he managed. Margaret looked up at him, and for a moment, something passed between them, something unspoken but heavy with meaning. Then she nodded, wrapped her shawl tight, and stepped out into the cool spring air. Reed watched until she disappeared down the trail. The first few days weren't so bad. Mrs. Hendricks came as promised, dropping off milk with brisk efficiency. Samuel ate and slept and cried on schedule. Reed managed. He told himself everything was fine. But by the 5th day, the cabin felt wrong. It was too quiet. Too empty. Reed found himself glancing toward the door, expecting Margaret's soft knock. He'd set the table for coffee and realized she wasn't coming. He'd pick up Samuel and start to call for her help before remembering she was gone. The evenings were the worst. Reed would sit in the rocking chair, Samuel in his arms, and the silence would press down on him like a physical weight. He missed her voice. Missed the way she hummed while she worked. Missed the rustle of her skirts, the smell of lavender soap, the quiet comfort of simply not being alone. A week passed. Then another. No word from Margaret. Reed tried to push down the worry gnawing at his chest. She'd said 2 weeks, maybe more. Her sister was sick. These things took time. But darker thoughts crept in during the long nights. What if something had happened on the journey? What if she'd decided not to come back? What if he'd taken her presence for granted and now she was simply gone? Samuel started fussing more, as if he sensed the change too. Reed walked the floor with him at night, bouncing and shushing, but nothing worked the way it did when Margaret was there. The baby missed her. Reed missed her. And that realization struck him like lightning. He missed Margaret Doyle. Not just her help. Not just what she did for Samuel. He missed her. The sound of her laugh. The way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching. The warmth she brought to this cold, lonely cabin. Reed stood at the window one night, Samuel finally asleep against his shoulder, staring out at the darkness. "Come back," he whispered. "Please come back." On the 15th day, Reed heard footsteps on the porch. He was at the stove, warming milk for Samuel's afternoon feeding. His heart lurched. He set down the pan and moved to the door, pulling it open before the knock even came. Margaret stood there, travel-worn and tired, her coat dusty from the road. But she was smiling. "Miss Doyle," Reed breathed. "I'm sorry I was gone so long. My sister's fever broke, but she needed." Margaret stopped, her smile fading. "Mr. Carter, are you all right?" Reed realized he was staring at her. That his hands were shaking. That he'd stepped outside without even realizing it, leaving the door wide open behind him. "I thought I'd lost you too," he said quietly. The words hung in the air between them. Margaret's eyes widened slightly, and Reed knew he'd said too much. Revealed too much. But he couldn't take it back now. "I didn't want to. I thought you weren't coming back," he continued, his voice rough. "And I couldn't. I shouldn't say this. It's too soon. It's not proper. But I can't pretend anymore, Miss Doyle. I care for you." Margaret's breath caught. She looked down, her cheeks flushing. "Mr. Carter. Reed. Please." She met his eyes again, and he saw something there, surprise, yes, but also something that looked like hope. "Reed," she said softly. "I feel the same." Relief flooded through him, so intense it made him lightheaded. But then Margaret's expression shifted, uncertainty creeping in. "But people already talk," she said. "If they knew we had feelings for each other, the gossip would only get worse. Let them talk. It's not that simple. My reputation." "Your reputation is spotless," Reed said firmly. "You're the kindest, most honorable person I know. Anyone who says differently is a fool." Margaret's eyes glistened. "Reed, I want this. But I won't let the scandal touch your family. Samuel deserves better than that." Reed stepped closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes. Then we'll do this right. Properly. The way the town expects. He took a breath. I'd like to court you, Miss Doyle. If you'll have me. Margaret looked up at him, a slow smile spreading across her face. I'd like that very much. From inside the cabin, Samuel started to cry. Margaret laughed, the tension breaking. May I? Please. They went inside together, and Margaret scooped up the baby, who immediately quieted in her arms. Reed watched them, his heart so full it hurt. This woman had walked through a blizzard for his son. Had given months of her life to help a grieving stranger. Had faced downtown gossip without flinching. And she cared for him. We'll take our time, Reed said. Court the proper way. Church on Sundays. Conversations on the porch where neighbors can see. Nothing that gives anyone reason to talk. Margaret nodded, swaying gently with Samuel. And when enough time has passed. I'll ask you to marry me, Reed finished. If you'll still want me then. Margaret looked at him over Samuel's head, her expression tender. I'll still want you. The courting began the following Sunday. Reed wore his best shirt and drove Margaret to church in the wagon, Samuel bundled between them. They sat together in the pew, proper and respectful, while half the congregation whispered and the other half smiled. After the service, they walked slowly through town, Samuel in Reed's arms, Margaret at his side. They kept a careful distance, but their eyes met often, speaking volumes without words. Mrs. Whitmore stopped them near the general store. Mr. Carter, Miss Doyle. I'm pleased to see you both looking so well. Her tone suggested she'd expected, maybe hoped for, something scandalous. Instead, she found only dignity. Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore, Margaret said politely. It's a beautiful day. The courting stretched through spring and into summer. Reed called on Margaret every Sunday after church, sitting with her on the porch of the boarding house where she lived. They talked about everything and nothing, books she was reading, repairs he was making to the cabin, Samuel's first smile, the way the prairie looked when wildflowers bloomed. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house, watched from the window with approval. Everything was proper. Everything was right. On warm evenings, they walked together through town, Samuel bundled in Reed's arms or, as he grew, carried in a sling Margaret had sewn. The baby would reach for her, and she'd take his tiny hand, and Reed would watch them both with an ache that was equal parts love and longing. The gossip faded. People saw what was plain to see, two decent people building something honest and good. Even Mrs. Whitmore softened, stopping Margaret one day to say she thought they made a fine match. By August, Reed knew he couldn't wait any longer. He rode into town on a Thursday afternoon and bought a simple gold band from the jeweler. That evening, he asked Margaret to come to the cabin. When she arrived, he met her at the door, Samuel on his hip. Walk with me? Reed asked. They walked to the small rise behind the cabin where the prairie stretched out endlessly, painted gold and orange in the sunset. Reed set Samuel down on a blanket, and the baby immediately grabbed at the grass, fascinated. Margaret stood beside Reed, the wind pulling at her hair. It's beautiful. It is. Reed turned to face her. Margaret, I've been thinking about the future. About what kind of life I want to build. She looked at him, her expression soft and knowing. I want to build it with you, Reed continued. I want Samuel to grow up knowing you as his mother. I want more children, if God grants them. I want to wake up every morning and see your face. I want to grow old with you on this prairie. He pulled the ring from his pocket. Will you marry me? Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Yes. Yes, Reed, I will. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and she laughed, wiping her eyes. Reed pulled her close, holding her tight, feeling like the broken pieces of his life had finally, impossibly, come back together. They married in September when the air turned crisp and the leaves began to gold. The ceremony was small, held in the church with half the town watching. Samuel, now 6 months old and gurgling happily, was passed between neighbors during the vows. When Reed kissed his bride, the congregation applauded. Margaret smiled against his lips, and Reed felt something he thought he'd never feel again, joy. Margaret moved into the cabin that night. Over the following months, Reed built a new room for Samuel, expanding the small home to fit their growing family. He worked carefully, wanting everything perfect. One evening, Margaret came to him holding a small wooden box. "I found this in the trunk," she said quietly. Reed recognized it immediately. His first wife's things, a lock of her hair, her wedding ribbon, a letter she'd started writing to her mother but never finished. "I was going to put it away," Reed said. "Don't." Margaret set the box on the shelf above the hearth. "This home is built on her love too, Reed. Samuel should know where he came from. Should know his mother wanted him, even if she couldn't stay." Reed looked at this woman who'd chosen them, who'd walked into their grief and transformed it into something beautiful. "I love you," he said. Margaret smiled. "I love you too." That winter, the cabin filled with new sounds, laughter, singing, the clatter of cooking pots, Samuel's delighted squeals as he learned to crawl. The silence that had nearly destroyed Reed was gone, replaced by the warm chaos of family. Through loss and winter and quiet courage, they'd learned that family isn't always born. Sometimes it's chosen. Sometimes it's built, piece by piece, by people brave enough to love again. And in that small cabin on the prairie, love was enough. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below telling us what moment moved you most. And if you want more true tales from the Wild West about courage, love, and second chances, subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Until next time, thanks for listening.